In 1980, 9 years after the hijacking, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was camping with his family on the banks of the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington. He found a package in the dirt. It contained $5,800 in decomposed $20 bills. The serial numbers matched the ransom money given to D.B. Cooper in 1971. The discovery generated enormous attention. The FBI searched the surrounding area extensively. No more money was found. No other physical evidence was recovered. The location was puzzling. It was miles from the suspected jump zone, and the condition of the bills suggested prolonged exposure to water and sediment. For decades, the money was treated as evidence of Cooper's fate. Perhaps he had died in the jump, and the money had washed downstream. Perhaps he had buried it and never returned. In 2020, a new analysis changed the picture. Researchers examined the diatoms, microscopic algae, found on the bills. Diatoms are seasonally specific. The particular diatoms found on Cooper's money bloom only in spring. Cooper jumped in November. The money entered the water in spring, at least 5 months after the hijacking, which means the money was somewhere else for those 5 months, which means Cooper, or someone who had the money, was alive and in possession of it through at least the spring of 1972, which means the theory that Cooper died in the jump and the money washed downstream from his landing zone doesn't work. Cooper survived. He had the money. He was alive for at least 5 months after November the 24th, 1971. And then, for reasons we don't know, some of the money ended up in the Columbia River. Not all of it. $5,800 of a $200,000 ransom. Less than 3%. The rest has never been found. Now we come back to the tie. The clip-on tie Cooper left on his seat has been in FBI custody since November the 25th, 1971. It provided the only DNA sample recovered from the case, though that sample has never matched any known individual in any database. For decades, the tie was treated as a dead end, a piece of fabric, evidence with nowhere to go. In 2025, the FBI released a new batch of files related to the Norjack investigation. The release was covered primarily for what it said about suspects. Several names, some familiar, some new, were discussed in the documents. But buried in a technical section of the release, in a forensic appendix that received almost no mainstream coverage, was a summary of a particle analysis conducted on the tie. The analysts had found, on the surface of the tie, over 100,000 microscopic particles. This is not unusual. Fabric accumulates particles from the environment it's worn in. A tie worn regularly in an office will carry particles from that office: paper dust, ink, building materials, trace elements from the air. What was unusual was the composition of some of those particles. The analysts identified traces of pure bismuth and unalloyed titanium. In 1971, these materials in combination were not common in everyday environments. Bismuth has industrial applications. It appears in certain metallurgical processes, in some pharmaceutical manufacturing contexts, and in specialized alloy production. Unalloyed titanium, titanium not mixed with other metals, was in 1971 almost exclusively associated with aerospace manufacturing. The specific combination of these two materials in particle form on a garment in 1971 pointed to a very narrow category of industrial environment. The analysts noted this in their report. They did not name the environment. They did not name a company. They did not draw a conclusion. They filed the finding and moved on. We did not move on. In 1971, the aerospace manufacturing sector in the Pacific Northwest was dominated by one company, Boeing. Boeing's facilities in the Seattle and Everett area were among the largest manufacturing operations in the country. They worked with titanium extensively. It was a critical material in aircraft construction, particularly in the high-stress components of jet airframes. They also worked with bismuth-containing alloys in specific manufacturing processes. Workers in those facilities, engineers, machinists, quality control personnel, contractors, would have worn their work clothes, gone home, changed into other clothes, worn those clothes in other environments. Trace particles from a manufacturing environment don't wash out completely. They transfer. They persist. A man who worked in or around Boeing's manufacturing operations in the early 1970s would have carried those particles on his clothing. We are not saying D.B. Cooper worked at Boeing. We are saying the particles on his tie are consistent with someone who spent significant time in a facility that processed bismuth alloys and unalloyed titanium in 1971. And in the Pacific Northwest in 1971, that description fits a narrow set of locations. The FBI knew this. The 2025 files show they knew this within 2 years of the hijacking. They had a category, they had a geographic area, they had a profile, and the investigation did not, as far as the public record shows, pursue that direction with the intensity the evidence warranted. We are not saying the FBI covered it up. We are saying the FBI made a choice. If we accept the particle evidence, if we accept that Cooper worked in or around aerospace manufacturing in the Pacific Northwest, a profile begins to emerge. Someone who knew aircraft intimately, not as a passenger, as someone who had spent time around them in a professional context. Someone who knew the 727's aft air stair, a detail that suggests familiarity with aircraft mechanical systems, not just general aviation knowledge. Someone based in or near the Portland-Seattle corridor. He bought his ticket in Portland, he knew the terrain, he knew the flight routes. Someone in his mid-40s in 1971, which would have made him born around 1925 to 1930. Part of the generation that served in World War II or Korea, who returned to civilian life and entered the post-war industrial economy. Someone calm under pressure. Someone who had planned carefully and expected the plan to work because plans, in his experience, worked when you thought them through. This is not a criminal profile. It's not the profile of a desperate man. It's the profile of someone who spent a career solving technical problems in high-stakes environments, who applied those same skills to a problem, how to acquire a significant sum of money and disappear, and executed the solution. We contacted 2 former Boeing employees who worked at the company's facilities in the early 1970s. Both asked not to be named. Both said the same thing in different words. The profile we described, calm, methodical, knowledgeable about aircraft systems, physically capable, former military, described a significant percentage of the people they worked with. One of them added, if someone who worked at Boeing in the early 1970s wanted to disappear after the jump, they would have known exactly how to do it. They would have had the skills and the contacts, and they would have been smart enough to never tell anyone. The diatom evidence tells us Cooper was alive through at least spring 1972. The $5,800 found in 1980 tells us that at some point, Some of the money ended up in the Columbia River, not from the jump site, but from a location closer to the Portland area. Here is a possible sequence that fits all the known evidence. Cooper survives the jump. He lands in the wilderness, in darkness, in near-freezing temperatures. He has $200,000 in $20 bills, a physically heavy package, and 2 parachutes. He moves through the wilderness to a pre-planned extraction point. Someone picks him up, or he has a vehicle cached. He disappears into ordinary life. Over the following months, he understands the magnitude of the investigation. He understands that spending the bills is impossible. The serial numbers were published. He has money he cannot use. At some point in the spring of 1972, he disposes of some of it. Perhaps he buries it. Perhaps he puts it in the river deliberately to create a false trail. Perhaps he panics, or perhaps he makes a calculated decision. The $5,800 found in 1980 was a small fraction of the total, not the whole cash, but a bundle, perhaps from the edge of a package that deteriorated over time. The rest of the money has never surfaced. Not in circulation, not in any bank, not in any estate, which means it's either still buried somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, or it was destroyed, or Cooper spent the rest of his life sitting on it, unable to use it, watching it slowly become worthless as inflation eroded its value, having pulled off the only unsolved hijacking in American history, and having nothing to show for it. We want to be direct about something. We don't know why the FBI did not publicly pursue the aerospace manufacturing lead with more intensity. There are several possible explanations, none of which require conspiracy. The most mundane, the particle analysis was one lead among thousands, and the Bureau's resources were finite. Thousands of Boeing employees fit parts of the profile. Without a stronger connection, a name, a witness, a financial trail, the lead may have been genuinely unperceivable. A less mundane possibility, by the mid-1970s, the case had acquired a cultural life of its own. D.B. Cooper had become a folk hero, celebrated in songs, in films, in popular mythology, as a man who outsmarted the system. An investigation that implicated a specific company or sector carried political and reputational dimensions that a straightforward criminal case did not. The most uncomfortable possibility: someone, at some level, knew more than was ever put in the files. And the 2025 release, partial, selective, covering only some of what Norjack generated, is not the complete picture. We are not saying this is what happened. We are saying the evidence we have, the tie, the particles, the diatoms, the money, forms a coherent picture that points somewhere specific, and that somewhere has never been fully explored in public. Here is what we know. A man hijacked a plane in 1971, received $200,000, and jumped into the dark over Washington. He was never found. The money was never recovered. The only physical evidence, a clip-on tie, contains particles consistent with aerospace manufacturing in the Pacific Northwest. The diatom evidence proves he survived at least until spring 1972. The FBI closed the case in 2016 without a resolution. In 2025, they released files that contain more than the public conversation has acknowledged. Here is what we don't know: his real name, where he landed, where he went, whether he's still alive. He would be in his late 90s now, if the mid-40s estimate was correct. Whether the rest of the money still exists somewhere. And why If the particle evidence pointed as clearly as we believe it did toward a specific professional environment, that direction was never publicly pursued to its conclusion. We're laying out what we found. You decide what it means. If you know something we don't, you know where to find us. Subscribe, share this, and leave a comment. Because D.B. Cooper didn't just disappear into the dark over Washington. He disappeared into a life. And somewhere in that life, there are people who knew him, and some of them are still out there.